All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're unpacking one of the most devastating, truly complex events in human history, the First World War. Now, it's incredibly easy to just say, well, a global war started because a single bullet was fired. But the reality? It's this fascinating, deadly chain reaction that just quickly spiraled completely out of anyone's control. In this explainer, we're going to trace exactly how a single localized assassination attempt ignited an alliance system that literally dragged the entire planet into the trenches.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp the sheer scale of this conflict, we're going to break it down into 6 phases: the Balkan tinderbox, the Western Front, the global war, chaos in the East, revolutions in the USA, and finally, collapse and punitive peace.
Starting with Section 1, the Balkan tinderbox explodes, a patchwork of tension.
So, to understand 1914, you really have to look at the Balkans. This part of Europe was a complex patchwork of cultures and religions, all desperate for their own independent states. Serbia was a nationalist kingdom on the rise. They had just defeated the Ottomans in Bulgaria, and they wanted to unite with their brothers in Bosnia. The problem was, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had annexed Bosnia just a few years prior. So, in 1914, nationalist Serbians hatched this plan to free Bosnia by killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, during his visit on June 28th. But guys, the execution of this plan was almost absurdly disastrous. First, an assassin throws a bomb, but it literally bounces off the back of the Archduke's open-top car. Dramatically, the assassin swallows cyanide and jumps into a river to escape, but the cyanide was old and the summer heat had dried up the river, so he survives. The Archduke then decides to visit the wounded at the hospital, but his driver takes a wrong turn. Realizing the mistake, the driver slowly reverses, basically stalling the car right in front of Gavrilo Princip, another assassin, who then fires the fatal shot. It's just a sheer dark irony of coincidences.
And that single shot set off Europe's incredibly complex alliance system like crashing dominoes. Austria-Hungary blames Serbia and declares war. Serbia's ally, Russia, gets involved. Then Germany, who is allied with Austria, declares war on Russia and France. Within a matter of weeks, this localized dispute rapidly drags Europe into 2 massive opposing sides, the Allied Entente and the Central Powers.
Moving to Section 2, stalemate on the Western Front. The old world meets new war. This is where 19th century ideas of military glory slam headfirst into the brutal reality of 20th century technology. Germany's grand strategy was called the Schlieffen Plan. They knew fighting a 2-front war against Russia and France would be a nightmare, so they planned to knock France out quickly. To avoid heavy French fortifications, they asked neutral Belgium if they could just march right through. Belgium said no. Well, Germany invaded anyway, which immediately pulled the British into the war. Germany steamrolled through Belgium but got fiercely stuck at the Battle of the Marne near Paris. Both sides desperately tried to outflank each other, and they ended up in this massive running and digging competition that stretched all the way from the North Sea down to the Swiss Alps.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is understanding the horrific, costly routine of trench warfare. Once those trenches were dug, they barely moved for years. The routine was a nightmare. First, you have hours of artillery shelling, leaving soldiers totally traumatized with shell shock. Then the commander blows the whistle. Young 18-year-olds are ordered to go over the top and run across no man's land, which was sometimes 200 meters of completely open ground, directly into reinforced machine gun nests. It was painstaking, it was deadly, and it yielded almost 0 territorial gains.
Desperate to break this stalemate, both sides turned to terrifying new technologies. Germany introduced poison gas, right? They'd hide hundreds of gas canisters in their trenches, and when the wind blew the right way, they unleashed these massive deadly clouds. But if the wind shifted, the gas blew right back onto their own men. Meanwhile, the British unveiled the very first tanks, literal moving fortresses they called land ships. At the Battle of the Somme, 18 of these metal boxes crawled toward the German lines. They caused absolute panic, but they were so clunky and unreliable that most of them actually broke down before even reaching the enemy trenches.
That brings us to Section 3, the war goes global, setting the whole house on fire.
The logic here was simple. If you can't break the front door down, you try to set the whole house on fire. Britain and France had a massive advantage with their sprawling global empires. They turned the entire planet into a resource pool to outlast the enemy. The Entente powers shipped over 1 million soldiers from India alone, plus hundreds of thousands more from Canada, Australia, and African colonies. Just think about that. These young men were pulled across oceans to fight and die in muddy European trenches thousands of kilometers from home, simply to ensure the Allies could keep importing fresh men and food indefinitely.
Meanwhile, Germany was effectively trapped.
The incredibly powerful British Navy established a total blockade in the North Sea, totally cutting Germany off from global trade. Germany was literally starving, they couldn't get food or even fertilizer. So, in a desperate reverse sort of strategy, Germany unleashes U-boat submarines to sink the merchant fleets that were feeding the Allies. They sank Allied and neutral ships alike, including the luxury passenger ship Lusitania, which resulted in the death of 128 Americans, and as we'll see, that was a move that would definitely come back to haunt them.
As the war expanded, it brought unspeakable tragedies far beyond the battlefields. Over in the Ottoman Empire, crumbling morale led the leadership to use the Armenian population as a scapegoat. Falsely accusing them of aiding the Russians, the Ottomans authorized forced removals that they masked as simple relocation. Men were executed, and households were sent on brutal death marches right into the Syrian desert without food or water. By 1923, an estimated 1.5 million Armenians were slaughtered in a horrific genocide.
Section 4. Chaos in the East. Fast-paced destruction.
There's this great quote about Russia at the time. A 19th century country trying to play a 20th century war. Well, the Western Front was totally paralyzed by trenches. The Eastern Front and the Alps saw massive sweeping troop movements, but with just as much destruction. In 1914, the Russian Empire mobilized incredibly fast, invading East Prussia in just 2 weeks. But Germany sent in their pro-generals who absolutely crushed them at the Battle of Tannenberg. By 1915, Russia was in a full retreat, suffering 2 million casualties in a single year. They were so vastly under-equipped that they were actually sending soldiers to the front without rifles, telling them to just pick one up when a comrade died. No way to fight a modern war, right?
But Russia threw absolutely all its money at the war effort and managed to bounce back. A Russian general named Brusilov realized that attacking one focused spot just wasn't working. So he launched a staggering 450-kilometer-long offensive, basically attacking everywhere at once. It was the largest Allied push of the entire war. To put that in perspective, the Austro-Hungarian lines broke so badly they lost 400,000 men as prisoners in a matter of weeks. Their empire was so shattered that Germany essentially had to take over as their puppeteer for the rest of the war.
Section 5. Revolutions and American Entry. Tipping the scales.
By 1917, the unimaginable internal strain of total war finally pushed major powers to their absolute breaking point, while pulling a brand new global heavyweight into the fray. Inside Russia, the people had had enough. Casualties were catastrophic, food was incredibly scarce, and the Tsar was incompetent. In just 8 days, a strike in Petrograd turned into a full-blown revolution. The Tsar was overthrown. But the new republic kept fighting the war, so the people got rid of them too, turning to communism. The new Soviet government, led by figures like Trotsky, tried this bizarre no war, no peace strategy, basically just walking away from the front lines. The Germans responded by simply smashing into Russia, forcing them to sign a terrible treaty where Russia lost a third of its population and half of its industry.
And this brilliantly illustrates the final straw. With Russia out, Germany felt cocky and made a fatal miscalculation. They had already angered the United States with their U-boat attacks, but then the British intercepted the Zimmermann telegram. Germany had literally messaged Mexico, asking them to attack the United States in exchange for reclaiming southwestern American states. The British showed this to the Americans, and that was it. The United States entered the war, bringing fresh troops and massive financial backing to the entirely exhausted Entente.
Finally, Section 6, Collapse and Punitive Peace, the bitter end.
Knowing those Americans were arriving, Germany hit the panic button. They threw absolutely everything they had at the Allies in a massive spring offensive, pushing dangerously close to Paris. But it just wasn't enough. Germany ran out of supplies, and the Central Powers were entirely exhausted. Then, the dominoes cascaded. In September 1918, Bulgaria gets knocked out. In October, the Ottomans sue for peace, and Austria-Hungary shatters into pieces after a devastating loss to Italy. By November, the German defenses collapse. Their military mutinies, Kaiser Wilhelm flees to the Netherlands, and finally, on November 11th, Germany surrenders.
40 million total casualties. When you step back, it is deeply sobering to think that a wrong turn by a driver in the Balkans resulted in millions of soldiers being pulled from across the globe, sent to die in trenches, freezing mountains, and deserts over 4 gruesome years.
The war ended at Versailles, but the Entente powers wanted to ensure Germany could never, ever rise as a world power again. The demands were absolutely crushing. Germany was stripped of 1/8 of its territory and all of its global colonies. Its army was strictly limited to a mere 100,000 men, with no air force and no submarines permitted.
And crucially, they were forced to take full absolute responsibility for the entire war and pay a staggering $33 billion in reparations to the victors.
Which leaves us with this haunting question. The war to end all wars was over, but the peace treaty was so punitive, so deeply humiliating, and economically